The quiet. Need to explain. There are days when nothing is actually wrong, and yet something feels slightly off, like a sound you can't locate. You wake up, move through your morning answer. Messages make plans, cancel others, and on the surface, everything looks normal, productive, reasonable. But somewhere between the coffee cooling on the counter and the last light turning green, you notice it again. That small pause. That moment before you speak. Before you choose. You already know what you're going to do. That's the strange part. The decision has been made somewhere inside you quickly and cleanly. But instead of letting it stand, you hear yourself adding something extra. A reason. A softener. A few sentences meant to make the choice easier for someone else to swallow. You explain before anyone asks. You justify before anyone questions. And you do it so naturally that it barely registers as a choice at all. Maybe it's a text you rewrite 3 times. The words are simple at first. I can't make it tonight. But then they start growing. I'm exhausted. It's been a long week. I just need a quiet night. You read it back and feel a small sense of relief, as if you've done something kind. As if you've protected the other person from something sharp or selfish. Only later, sometimes much later, do you notice that the original sentence would have been enough. Or maybe it's a conversation at work, or with family, or with someone you love. You say yes when you mean maybe. You say maybe when you mean no. And when you finally say no, it comes wrapped in careful language, padded with concern, delivered like an apology instead of a fact. You watch yourself do it from the inside, almost as if someone else has taken over your voice, someone practiced, someone polite, someone who knows how to keep things smooth. This is not about fear in the obvious sense. It doesn't feel dramatic. There's no racing heart, no clear panic. It's quieter than that. It's a habit that's been with you for so long, it feels like part of your personality. Like good manners, like being considerate, like being the kind of woman people describe as easy to talk to. You've been praised for this. Not always directly, but enough that you noticed. People respond well to you. They say you're thoughtful, understanding, flexible. They trust you. They lean on you. They feel safe with you. And somewhere along the way that became important. Not in a loud way, not in a way you would have named, just enough that you learned how to keep that image intact. There is a version of you that steps forward in these moments. She's calm, she's reasonable, she doesn't make things awkward, she doesn't force anyone to adjust too much. She explains her choices so no one feels left out or blamed or uncomfortable. She knows how to read a room, she knows when to soften her tone, when to smile, when to add a sentence that says, I thought about you. This version of you has done a lot for you. She has kept relationships going. She has smoothed over misunderstandings. She has helped you move through the world without causing friction. She is not a mistake. She didn't appear out of nowhere. She learned slowly what worked. But lately something has started to happen. Not a breakdown, not a rebellion, just a faint resistance. A sense that each explanation costs a little more than it used to. That after certain conversations you feel oddly tired even when nothing emotional was discussed. You replay the exchange later, not because anything went wrong, but because something didn't sit right. You notice how often your choices turn into negotiations even when they don't need to be. How often you adjust your words to make sure no one feels dismissed. How rarely you let a decision land without cushioning it first. And once you see it, you can't fully unsee it. It shows up in small ways. You delay replying not because you don't know what to say, but because you're trying to find the most acceptable version of it. You rehearse explanations in your head while doing other things. You feel a flicker of irritation when someone else states their needs plainly without preface or apology, and then you immediately smooth that irritation over, telling yourself they're just different, more direct, more confident. You don't resent them exactly. You just notice the contrast, how they move through decisions without circling them. How they don't seem to worry about being misunderstood in the same way. How their no doesn't come with a story attached. And then there's the other side of it, the part you don't talk about. The moments when you don't explain not because you don't want to, but because you're too tired, when you go quiet instead. When you withdraw just enough to avoid having to justify yourself again. It's subtle. You don't announce it. You just become less available, less expressive. You answer briefly, you keep things surface level. From the outside, it probably looks like calm, or maturity, or independence. But inside, it feels more like holding something in your mouth and not knowing where to put it. You haven't said anything wrong. You haven't done anything wrong. And yet there's a pressure building from all the words you didn't say and all the words you said when you didn't need to. This isn't about wanting to be difficult. It's not about wanting to push people away. If anything, it's the opposite. You've spent so long learning how to stay connected, how to remain welcome, how to keep the peace that the idea of not explaining yourself feels like a risk. A small one maybe, but real. There's a belief tucked inside this habit, quiet but persistent. That clarity without explanation might come across as cold, that a simple statement might sound harsh, that choosing without context could be misread as indifference. You don't think this in full sentences. It lives more like a background rule, something you follow without questioning the way you follow traffic signals, even on empty streets. And yet every so often the rule falters. You catch yourself wondering why a grown woman needs to sound agreeable in order to sound acceptable, why your choices feel incomplete unless someone else understands them, why the moment you stop explaining feels heavier than the moment you start. You might remember times when you did speak plainly, times when you said what you meant without wrapping it up. Maybe it didn't go terribly, maybe nothing dramatic happened at all, but something in you stayed alert afterward as if waiting for a consequence, a shift in tone, a withdrawal of warmth, proof that you'd crossed some invisible line. Often no such proof comes. Life goes on, people adjust, and still the habit remains. Because it isn't really about what happens next. It's about what you've learned to anticipate, the possibility of being seen differently, the risk of no longer fitting the version of yourself that feels safe to inhabit. This version, the one who explains, is familiar. She knows how to navigate expectations. She knows how to stay in good standing. She knows how to keep things moving forward. But she also keeps you slightly at a distance from yourself. Just enough that your choices feel like they belong to a committee instead of a single voice. You don't think of it this way, of course. In daily life, it feels practical, considerate, normal. But there are moments, usually late at night or in the quiet after a long day, when you sense the accumulation of it. The weight of all the small ways you've edited yourself to remain palatable. You might sit with that feeling for a minute, then push it aside. There's always something else to do, someone to respond to, another decision to make. And besides, nothing is technically wrong. You're functioning, you're loved, you're needed. These are good things. Still, the feeling returns. Not as a complaint, but as a question you don't quite ask. What would it be like to let a choice stand on its own? What would happen if you didn't rush to soften the edges? What would change if you trusted that your decision didn't need to be translated? You don't answer these questions, not yet. You just notice them. Let them hover. Let them unsettle you slightly. There is no rush, no turning point. Just a growing awareness that something you've always done automatically might not be as neutral as it once seemed. And so this is where the story begins. Not with a confrontation or a declaration or a dramatic break, but with a pattern becoming visible, with a woman noticing the space between what she decides and what she feels allowed to say, with the quiet tension of realizing that being good has slowly started to feel like explaining yourself out of your own life. Nothing resolves here. Nothing is fixed. The habit doesn't disappear. You will still explain tomorrow, and the day after that. But now there is a witness inside you, calm, observant, no longer entirely convinced that this is just the way things are, and that for now is enough to keep you listening. When choices start sounding like requests, there is a moment that keeps repeating once you start paying attention. It happens after the decision has already been made, but before it has fully entered the world. It's the instant when your voice shifts almost imperceptibly from stating to asking, from choosing to checking, from certainty to carefulness. And the strange thing is, no one told you to do that. No one interrupted. No one challenged you. The change happens inside you first. You might hear it in your own tone, the way your sentences lift at the end as if inviting approval, the way you leave space for negotiation even when you don't want one. You say things like, "I was thinking maybe," or "Does that work for you?" or "I'm not sure," but these phrases slide in so easily they barely feel like additions. They feel like courtesy, like being thoughtful, like keeping the door open. But the door you're opening isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's for the version of you that worries about how your choice will land, about whether it will ripple out in ways you can't control, about whether someone will feel disappointed, inconvenienced, or quietly resentful. You imagine these reactions before they happen. Sometimes, even when they never do. It's not that you don't trust people, it's that you've learned to anticipate their reactions as part of your own decision-making process. Somewhere along the way, choosing stopped being a private act and became a shared one, even when no one else was officially involved. You might notice this most clearly with small things. Choosing a restaurant, picking a time, deciding whether to stay or leave. These should be simple, and sometimes they are, until you hear yourself explaining why this option makes sense, why it's reasonable, why it's not too much to ask. You build a case for your preference as if presenting it to an invisible panel. The panel is rarely hostile. That's what makes this so difficult to name. There is no clear opposition, no obvious threat, just the possibility of disapproval, faint but persistent, the possibility of being seen as inflexible, or demanding, or selfish. Words you might never use out loud, but which carry weight nonetheless. You've watched other women navigate this differently. Some of them state what they want and wait. They don't rush to justify. They don't fill the silence. They don't apologize for taking up space with a decision. You observe them with a mix of admiration and distance, telling yourself they're just wired that way. Stronger, more direct, less concerned. But you know it's not that simple. You know how much effort it takes to override a habit that's been rewarded for years. You know how many times being accommodating led to praise, acceptance, relief. You learned early that harmony has value, that friction has consequences, even if those consequences were subtle. So when your choices start sounding like requests, it feels safer, more familiar. You're not demanding anything, you're offering a suggestion, you're being considerate. And if the other person pushes back, you can adjust without losing face. You haven't planted a flag. You've just tested the ground. The problem is not that you adjust, it's that you do it before you know whether it's needed. You preemptively soften as if bracing for impact that hasn't occurred. And in doing so, you quietly downgrade your own authority over your time, your energy, your direction. You don't notice this in the moment. In the moment, you're focused on connection, on keeping things smooth, on being someone people enjoy dealing with. The cost shows up later in the way you replay conversations and wonder why you feel slightly diminished afterward, why a simple exchange left you feeling off balance. It's hard to pinpoint because nothing overtly wrong happened. No one criticized you. No one dismissed your needs. In fact, they may have agreed with you. They may have accommodated your choice. And still, something feels unresolved. That unresolved feeling comes from the gap between what you decided and how you presented it, between the clarity you felt internally and the hesitation you allowed externally. Each time this happens, it leaves a small residue. Not anger, not sadness. Something quieter, a sense of having stepped aside from yourself just a little. You might try to tell yourself it doesn't matter, that this is how relationships work, that flexibility is a strength, and in many ways, it is. But flexibility without choice starts to look like erasure. And you feel that erasure most when you're alone again, when there's no one left to impress or accommodate. In those moments, you sometimes ask yourself why stating a preference feels heavier than explaining it, why letting a decision stand feels more exposed than surrounding it with reasons. You don't always like the answer, so you don't linger there for long. Instead, you notice patterns, how you prepare explanations even when you're not sure you'll need them, how you scan for reactions while you're speaking, adjusting in real time, how you feel relief when someone responds warmly and tension when they don't, even if their response is neutral. You begin to see how much of your attention is tied up in managing perception, not because you're insecure in some dramatic way, but because you've learned that being perceived well matters, that it keeps things stable, that it keeps you safe within the role you occupy. This role is not something you consciously chose. It grew around you. It adapted to different environments. With family, it might look like being the reasonable one, the peacemaker, the one who doesn't rock the boat. In romantic relationships, it might look like being easygoing, low maintenance, understanding. At work, it might show up as being flexible, reliable, willing to go the extra mile. Each version has its own logic. Each one makes sense in context. But across all of them, the same habit persists. Your choices are filtered through how they will be received. Your voice is shaped by the desire to remain acceptable. You don't call this fear. You don't call it suppression. You call it being considerate, being mature, being thoughtful. And those words are not wrong. They're just incomplete. Because alongside them lives another experience, the experience of watching yourself step back from a clear boundary, of offering an explanation where a statement would have sufficed, of feeling a quiet resentment flicker and then immediately extinguishing it. This resentment doesn't explode, it doesn't demand attention. It settles, it waits. It shows up later as exhaustion, as distance, as a vague sense that you're carrying more than you should without being able to say exactly what that is. Sometimes you wonder what would happen if you didn't explain. If you simply said, "This is what I'm doing," and let the silence follow. The idea feels uncomfortable not because you expect disaster, but because you don't know how you would hold yourself in that space. Without the buffer of reasons, without the familiar role, you imagine the other person's face, their reaction, their interpretation. You imagine having to sit with their discomfort if it comes, and then you imagine having to sit with your own. The part of you that has learned to smooth things over would have nothing to do. That part of you doesn't like being idle. She exists to manage, to anticipate, to keep things flowing. When you don't give her a task, she becomes restless. She starts whispering questions. Are you sure this is okay? Shouldn't you say more? What if they misunderstand? These whispers are persuasive because they sound reasonable. They sound like concern, like care, like foresight. And so more often than not, you listen. You add the explanation. You soften the edge. You return to familiar ground. But the awareness remains. Each time you do this now, there is a split second where you see it happening, where you recognize the choice to explain as a choice, not a necessity. And that recognition changes the texture of the moment. It introduces friction where there used to be none. Not enough to stop the behavior, but enough to make it conscious. Enough to make you wonder what this habit has been protecting you from and what it has been costing you in return. You're not ready to change it. Not yet. You're not even sure you want to. This isn't about forcing yourself into a different way of being. It's about noticing the shape of the one you've been living in. So you keep watching. You notice how your language shifts under pressure, how your certainty dissolves when you sense potential disapproval, how quickly you move to reassure others that you're not asking for too much. And somewhere in that watching, another question begins to form. Not loud, not urgent, just persistent. What part of you learned that choosing needs to sound like asking? And what would it mean to let that part rest, even briefly? You don't answer this question. You let it sit beside you like a companion you're not sure you invited. It doesn't demand anything, it just observes. And as it does, the story continues moving deeper into the spaces where habits were formed and roles were learned, where being good slowly became indistinguishable from being agreeable. Nothing resolves here either. The pattern remains, the explanations continue, but now they carry weight. Now each one adds to a growing sense that something essential has been deferred, that the cost of always sounding reasonable is beginning to surface, and you stay with that feeling. Not to fix it, not to escape it, just to recognize it as part of your experience, because this story isn't about sudden clarity or decisive action. It's about the slow, uncomfortable work of seeing yourself clearly, even when what you see unsettles the balance you've worked so hard to maintain. When this chapter ends, you don't feel finished, you feel suspended, aware of a pattern but still inside it, and that awareness, quiet as it is, keeps you listening for what comes next. The habit of softening decisions. Once you've seen how often your choices turn into requests, another pattern begins to surface. It's quieter, more subtle, but just as persistent. It's the way you soften decisions even after they've already been accepted. The way you revisit what you've said, not to change the outcome, but to make it easier for everyone else to live with. You notice this most in the aftermath. The decision is technically done. The plan is set. The boundary has been named. And yet you feel the urge to return to it like someone straightening a picture frame that's already hanging level. You add a follow-up message, a quick clarification, a reassurance that you didn't mean anything by it, that you're still flexible, that you're not upset. It's as if letting a decision stand on its own feels unfinished, as if clarity without cushioning leaves something exposed. So you soften it, you round the edges, you make sure no one is left wondering whether you're still kind, still available, still the same person they've always known. This softening doesn't come from pressure in the room. Often no one is asking for it. No one seems bothered. In fact, people might move on without a second thought. But inside you, there's a sense that something needs tending, a relationship to maintain, an image to protect. a role to stay aligned with. You've learned how to do this so well that it barely feels like effort. You might say, "Just to be clear," or "I hope that's okay," or "I didn't want it to come across the wrong way." These phrases slip in easily like habits of speech. They don't sound dramatic. They don't sound needy. They sound polite, responsible, caring. And because they sound so reasonable, it's hard to question them. It's hard to ask why a clear decision needs this much aftercare. Why you feel responsible for managing not just the outcome, but everyone's internal response to it. Sometimes this shows up as over-explaining after the fact. You replay the conversation and realize you left out something that might help the other person understand you better. So you add it. You send another message. You bring it up again later. Not because the decision is in danger, but because your comfort with it seems fragile unless it's fully understood. Other times it shows up as self-correction. You downplay your own firmness. You say things like, "I'm probably overthinking this," or "It's not a big deal." You make your choice smaller, lighter, easier to dismiss. As if you're afraid that letting it carry weight would somehow make you harder to be around. You might tell yourself this is just how you communicate, that you value clarity, that you don't want misunderstandings. And that's true to a point. But there's a difference between clarity and dilution, between making sure you're understood and making sure you're agreeable. The line between those two can be hard to see when you've spent years walking it instinctively, especially when being agreeable has brought you connection, approval, peace. You've seen what happens when things aren't softened. You've felt the tension in rooms where someone stood firm without explanation. You've noticed how quickly labels appear. Difficult, cold, uncooperative. You didn't want to be that person. You wanted to be someone others felt comfortable with. Someone who didn't create unnecessary friction. And so you learned to translate your needs into something easier to receive. But translation always involves loss. Something gets altered in the process. And over time, the thing that gets lost is your sense of finality. Your ability to say, "This is my decision," and let it be enough. Instead, decisions remain slightly open-ended. Not officially, but energetically. You leave space for revision, for adjustment, for backtracking if needed. And while this might seem generous, it comes at a cost. It means your choices never fully belong to you. They remain provisional, dependent on how well they're received. You feel this cost most when someone takes you up on that openness, when they push back gently, or ask for more, or suggest an alternative. Even if you agree, even if the change makes sense, there's often a flicker of something inside you, a brief tightening, a sense that you've given up ground without meaning to. You don't voice this. You might not even fully register it. You simply adjust. You tell yourself it's fine, that flexibility is good, that relationships require compromise. And again, none of this is untrue. But compromise loses its meaning when it happens automatically without you ever standing fully in your original position. The habit of softening decisions keeps you in motion. It prevents conflict, but it also prevents rest. You're always managing, always monitoring, always ready to smooth something over, even when nothing is actually rough. This becomes especially clear in moments when you wish someone else would take the lead. When you long for someone to state what they want clearly so you don't have to negotiate the space between. When you feel relief around people who don't require this level of adjustment from you. You notice how different it feels to be with someone who doesn't need to be managed, someone who can hear a decision without taking it personally, someone who doesn't require reassurance that they're still valued. Around them, you speak more plainly. You don't feel the urge to soften as much. And the contrast is striking. It makes you wonder whether the softening is always about you, or whether it's also about the dynamics you've learned to inhabit, the roles you've taken on, the expectations that have quietly shaped how you show up. You've often been the one who adapts, the one who notices what others need, the one who keeps things running smoothly. This didn't happen by accident. It happened because you're perceptive, because you care, because you learned early how to read a room. These are real strengths. They've allowed you to build relationships, navigate complexity, avoid unnecessary harm. But like all strengths, when overused, they begin to turn on you. They start to demand more than they give back. The softening becomes less about kindness and more about containment. Containing your own edges, containing your own impact, making sure you don't take up too much space with a decision that might inconvenience someone else. And yet the more you do this, the more you feel the absence of something, not in a dramatic way, not as a crisis, just as a quiet sense that your life is being lived slightly sideways, that you're present but not fully grounded in your own choices. You might notice this when you're alone, when no one needs anything from you, when there's no one to accommodate or reassure. In those moments, you sometimes feel a strange mix of relief and restlessness. Relief because you don't have to manage anyone else's response. Restlessness because you're not sure how to rest inside yourself without that familiar role. The habit of softening decisions has kept you oriented outward. It has trained you to measure yourself against others' reactions, to adjust in real time, to remain responsive. Letting go of it, even temporarily, feels disorienting, and so you don't let go. Not fully. You just become more aware of it. You start noticing how often you follow up a decision with an explanation, how often you check for signs that everything is still okay, how often you minimize your own clarity to keep things smooth. This awareness doesn't make the habit disappear. In some ways, it makes it heavier, because now you see the choice inside the pattern. You see that you are not forced to soften. You are choosing to. And that choice carries meaning. You might feel a quiet irritation with yourself for not stopping, or a quiet compassion recognizing how long this habit has kept you safe. Both reactions pass. What remains is the sense that something is shifting, even if nothing on the surface has changed. You start to sense that your explanations are doing double duty. They're not just for others, they're also for you. They help you feel justified, reasonable, allowed, as if your decisions need a moral framework to stand on. Without that framework, you worry they might look arbitrary, or selfish, or careless. You worry that you might look like someone who doesn't consider others. And that image feels dangerous even if no one has ever accused you of it. So you soften, you clarify, you reassure, and in doing so, you maintain the image you've learned to rely on. The image of being good, thoughtful, easy to deal with. But images require upkeep. They require consistency. They require you to notice when you're drifting and correct course. And that constant monitoring leaves little room for stillness. There are moments, fleeting but real, when you imagine what it would be like to let a decision remain unsoftened, to say what you're doing and stop there, to resist the urge to follow up, to tolerate the silence that might come next. These moments don't turn into action. Not yet. They remain as thoughts, as sensations, as a subtle tightening in your chest when you stop yourself from sending that extra message. You don't frame this as growth or change. You don't tell anyone about it. It's too small for that, too internal. It's just a noticing, a quiet experiment in restraint. And even that restraint feels loaded. It brings up questions you're not ready to answer. Questions about why your decisions feel like they need approval, about when being considerate became indistinguishable from being careful, about how much of your life is shaped by the desire to remain acceptable. You don't push these questions away, but you don't chase them either. You let them hover. You let them accompany you as you move through familiar situations, family conversations, work meetings, intimate exchanges. Each time the pattern repeats. You decide, you soften, you explain. And each time the awareness grows a little sharper, the cost a little clearer. Not enough to force a change, but enough to deepen the tension. This chapter doesn't end with a decision to stop. It ends with recognition, with the understanding that softening has become second nature, that it has protected you and constrained you in equal measure. You remain inside the habit, but you are no longer entirely at home in it. You feel its weight now. You feel the way it keeps you slightly angled away from your own authority. And that feeling, unresolved and unaddressed, carries you forward. Because once you see how you soften your decisions, it becomes impossible not to notice the moments when you take them back entirely. When you don't just soften, but retreat. And that is where the next movement of this story begins. Being clear, then taking it back. There is a particular moment that follows clarity, and you know it well. It comes after you finally say what you mean. After you choose the thing you'd already decided on. After the words leave your mouth and land in the space between you and someone else. For a brief second, there is relief, a sense of alignment. You spoke honestly. You didn't dilute it. You didn't circle. And then almost immediately something else rises. A tightening, a second thought, a quiet impulse to return to the scene and adjust what you've just done. It doesn't arrive as panic. It arrives as responsibility, as awareness, as the thought that maybe you were too abrupt, that maybe your tone was firmer than necessary, that maybe the other person didn't expect that level of certainty from you. And so you go back. Sometimes it's literal. You send another message. You add a sentence. You say, "I didn't mean it like that," or "I just want you to know," or "I hope you understand." Other times, it's internal. You start reinterpreting what you said, softening it in your own mind, telling yourself you're still open, still flexible, still the same. This act of taking it back isn't dramatic. It doesn't feel like undoing. It feels like adjusting for balance, like correcting for a shift that might throw things off. You've learned that equilibrium matters, and you've become skilled at restoring it. What's harder to see is how quickly this happens, how little time you give yourself to stand inside your own clarity before you rush to modify it. It's almost as if certainty is allowed only briefly, like a breath held too long. Soon enough, you must exhale it into something softer. You might notice this pattern most clearly when you're setting a limit. You finally say you can't do something. You finally say you won't be available. You finally say, "This doesn't work for you." And then before the words have fully settled, you find yourself explaining the context, the reasons, the circumstances that make your boundary understandable. You want it to be received as reasonable, not final, as considerate, not firm. And in doing so, you leave a door open you hadn't meant to, a door for negotiation, for persuasion, for reinterpretation. Sometimes the other person walks right through it. They ask if there's another option, if you can reconsider, if it's really that set. And even if you hold your ground, the interaction leaves a mark. You feel as though you've invited a discussion you didn't want to have. Other times, nothing happens. The person accepts your boundary without comment. They move on. And still the discomfort remains. Because the unease wasn't actually about their reaction. It was about your own relationship to the clarity you expressed. You're not used to letting decisions land without adjustment. You're not used to leaving them untouched. There's a reflex inside you that reaches for the familiar tools of explanation and reassurance even when they're no longer needed. This reflex didn't come from nowhere. It was shaped over time through countless small interactions where being decisive had consequences. Maybe not overt ones. Maybe just subtle shifts. A change in tone. A pause where warmth used to be. A sense that you'd stepped slightly out of bounds. You learned to notice these things. You learned to correct course. You learned how to remain connected by remaining adjustable. And over time, that adaptability became a marker of who you are. So when you're clear now, it feels unfamiliar, exposed, as if you've stepped into a posture that isn't quite yours. Even if it feels right, it doesn't feel safe. Not yet. You might tell yourself that taking it back isn't really taking it back, that you're just being thoughtful, that you're adding nuance, that you don't want to be misunderstood. All of that may be true. But there's another layer beneath it, quieter and harder to admit. It's the part of you that isn't sure you're allowed to be done. The part that believes finality requires permission. That certainty, if left unsoftened, might be seen as arrogance or disregard. So you hedge. You qualify. You leave room for others to adjust the shape of your choice. And in doing so, you reduce the risk of being seen as someone who doesn't care. The cost of this pattern isn't always obvious. It doesn't announce itself. It accumulates. Each time you take back a clear statement, you teach yourself that clarity needs supervision, that it can't stand on its own, that it must be monitored and managed. Over time, this creates a subtle mistrust in your own decisions, not because they're wrong, but because you've learned to treat them as provisional, subject to revision based on how they're received. You might notice this mistrust when you hesitate to make choices without consulting others, when you seek reassurance before committing, when you second-guess decisions that once felt settled. The ground beneath you starts to feel less stable, not because it is, but because you've trained yourself to keep shifting. This is especially apparent in close relationships, with people whose opinions matter to you, people you don't want to disappoint. With them, the urge to take things back is strongest. You feel more responsible for how your choices affect them, more aware of the relational weight. You might say something honest and then immediately watch their face listening not just to their words, but to what's underneath. A hesitation, a pause, a lack of enthusiasm. And if you sense even the slightest misalignment, you step in to smooth it over. You say things like, "We can talk about it," or "I'm open to other ideas," or "It's not set in stone." You offer flexibility even when you don't want to change anything, because the alternative feels like standing alone with your choice. Standing alone isn't something you fear in the abstract. You live independently. You manage your life. You make countless decisions every day. But standing alone in a relational moment without softening or retreat feels different. It feels like withdrawing from a role you've inhabited for a long time. That role has taught you to remain responsive, to stay attuned, to keep the emotional field balanced. When you don't do that, even briefly, there's a sense of dereliction, as if you've neglected a duty no one explicitly assigned you, but which you nonetheless feel bound to fulfill. So you take it back. Not entirely, just enough to reassure. Just enough to maintain the image of yourself as someone who is easy to engage with, someone who doesn't make things hard. You rarely think of this as self-erasure. That word feels too strong, too dramatic. It's more like self-adjustment, self-editing, self-monitoring. And because it's so subtle, it's easy to dismiss its impact. But you feel it, in the quiet moments, in the way your body holds tension after certain conversations, in the fatigue that doesn't come from effort but from vigilance, from constantly scanning and correcting. There's also a grief embedded here, though you might not name it as such. A grief for the version of you that speaks once and stops, the version that trusts her words enough to let them stand. You catch glimpses of her occasionally, usually when you're too tired to manage the aftermath. In those moments, you say what you mean and don't follow up. You let the silence stretch. You don't rush to explain. And something about that feels both unsettling and relieving, like stepping out of a tight garment you didn't realize you were wearing. But relief quickly gives way to discomfort. You wonder if you've been too abrupt, if you've left something unsaid, if you've caused harm without meaning to. And so the next time you revert, you soften again. This back and forth creates its own tension. You're no longer fully at ease in either mode. The old way feels increasingly heavy. The new way feels unsteady. You're caught between them, aware but not yet anchored. You might notice how this shows up internally as self-questioning. Not about the content of your decisions, but about their delivery. Did I say that right? Did I say too much? Did I say too little? These questions loop long after the moment has passed. They don't always lead anywhere. They just circle. And the circling keeps you from resting in your own authority. It keeps you oriented toward correction instead of completion. What makes this particularly difficult is that from the outside, everything still looks fine. You're articulate, considerate, thoughtful. People respond well to you. They don't accuse you of being unclear or harsh. If anything, they might appreciate how much you explain. So there's no external pressure forcing you to change, no obvious problem demanding a solution, just an internal sense that something is misaligned. That clarity, followed by retreat, is leaving you slightly hollowed out. You don't dramatize this. You don't make it a crisis. You carry it quietly the way you carry so many things. But it's there, shaping your interactions, influencing your sense of presence. You begin to notice how often you override the first version of your truth with a more acceptable one. How often you prioritize being understood over being done. How often you reopen a decision that was already settled just to make sure no one feels unsettled. And slowly, another realization emerges, one you don't rush to articulate. That taking it back has become a way of staying connected without fully standing in yourself. A way of keeping the relationship intact, even if it means stepping slightly away from your own center. This realization doesn't lead to action, not yet. It leads to stillness, to observation, to a deeper awareness of the cost of constant adjustment. You start to sense that clarity isn't the hard part. You're capable of knowing what you want. The harder part is staying with it, letting it exist without apology, without modification, without retreat. And that's where this chapter leaves you, not with a decision to stop taking things back, not with a new rule or strategy, but with the growing awareness that every time you do something inside, you recedes. You remain attentive to this movement now. You feel it when it happens. The pull to soften, the urge to retract, the discomfort of standing still. And as that awareness deepens, another pattern begins to reveal itself. One where instead of softening or retreating, you choose silence altogether. That movement, quieter and more elusive, waits just ahead. When silence feels safer than finality. There comes a point when softening no longer feels sufficient, when explaining feels heavy, when taking things back feels like too much effort. And so without making a decision about it, you begin to do something else. You say less. It doesn't start as silence, not the kind people notice. It starts as restraint. You answer, but briefly. You respond, but without detail. You participate, but without offering anything that could be questioned or negotiated. You learn how to stay present without being fully exposed. This way, you don't have to explain, you don't have to soften, you don't have to take anything back. There's nothing to manage if nothing is fully said. At first, this feels like relief. Conversations move faster. Decisions feel lighter because you're not carrying them out loud. You don't have to brace yourself for how your words will land because your words don't travel very far. You keep them close. You might notice this happening in familiar settings, with people who know you well, with people whose reactions you've learned to anticipate. You sense the moment where speaking clearly would invite discussion and you step around it. You choose ambiguity over clarity. You let things remain vague. You say things like, "I'm not sure yet," or "we'll see," or "I'll let you know." These phrases give you time. They keep options open. They allow you to remain agreeable without committing to anything you might later need to defend. But silence, even partial silence, has its own weight. It doesn't disappear just because it's quiet. It settles. It accumulates in the spaces between interactions and the things left unsaid and the decisions postponed indefinitely. You might notice how often you delay responding, not because you don't care, but because you don't want to step into another round of explanation. You might notice how you avoid certain topics altogether, steering conversations towards safer ground. You become skilled at keeping things light. From the outside, this can look like ease, like confidence, like someone who doesn't need to say much. But inside, there's a careful calculation happening. You're measuring how much of yourself can be revealed without triggering the old cycle of justification and retreat. Silence becomes a strategy, not a conscious one, but a practiced one. It allows you to maintain connection without making demands. It allows you to stay involved without fully stepping forward. And yet there's a loneliness inside this restraint. Not the kind that comes from being alone, but the kind that comes from being present without being known. You're there, but you're holding something back. You're listening more than you're speaking. You're adapting more than you're expressing. This isn't a dramatic withdrawal. No one calls you out on it. No one asks what's wrong. In fact, people might appreciate how easy you are during this phase, how low maintenance, how undemanding. That appreciation reinforces the pattern. It tells you that silence works, that it keeps things smooth, that it protects you from the discomfort of clarity. But silence also delays resolution. It postpones the moment where your needs might clash with someone else's. It keeps you hovering in a state of almost choosing, almost speaking, almost being clear. You might feel this most strongly when you're asked directly what you want, when someone turns to you and waits. There's a brief pause where you consider saying it plainly, and then instead you deflect. You say it doesn't matter. You say you're fine with whatever. You say you don't have a strong preference. Sometimes this is true, sometimes it's not. But either way, the habit has become familiar. Deflection feels safer than declaration. Silence feels safer than finality. Finality carries weight. It implies responsibility. It implies ownership. It implies the possibility of disagreement. Silence allows you to remain uncommitted, which feels less risky even if it's less satisfying. You might tell yourself you're just choosing peace, that you're avoiding unnecessary friction, that you're being easygoing. And again, none of this is untrue. But peace built on self-erasure is fragile. It requires constant maintenance, constant restraint. You begin to notice the cost of this strategy when decisions are made without you. When plans move forward in directions you didn't choose but didn't oppose either. When your absence from the conversation is interpreted as agreement, you feel a flicker of frustration then. Not at others exactly, but at yourself. You realize you had a preference. You just didn't voice it. And now it feels too late. This frustration doesn't erupt, it turns inward. It becomes a quiet heaviness, a sense that you're living slightly behind your own life, watching it unfold rather than shaping it. You don't confront this directly, you're not ready to. You continue using silence as a buffer, as a way to stay involved without risking rejection, as a way to avoid the vulnerability of standing fully in a choice. But the silence changes you. It makes you less responsive, less engaged. You start feeling detached even in moments that should feel intimate. You're there, but part of you is observing from a distance. That observing part is growing stronger now. It notices how often silence replaces clarity, how often withdrawal replaces expression, how often you choose not to choose just to avoid the aftermath. This part doesn't judge you. It doesn't push. It simply watches. It sees how silence has become a compromise between wanting to be clear and fearing the consequences of clarity. You might feel this watching presence most acutely when you're alone, when there's no one to accommodate, no one to reassure. In those moments, the silence feels different, heavier, less protective. You realize then that silence hasn't brought you closer to yourself. It's just given you a place to hide, a way to avoid both conflict and authenticity. That realization doesn't lead to immediate change. It doesn't inspire a sudden burst of honesty. It simply settles. It adds another layer to your understanding of how you move through relationships. You begin to see the progression clearly now. How explanation led to softening, how softening led to taking things back, how taking things back led to silence. Each step felt reasonable. Each step felt safer than the last. And yet each step also moved you further away from something essential, from the ability to let your choices exist without modification, from the experience of being met as you are, rather than as you present yourself. This chapter ends not with speech, but with awareness of its absence, with the recognition that silence has become a refuge, but also a limitation, that it keeps you protected, but also unseen. You don't break the silence yet. You stay within it, but now you feel its edges. You sense how it constrains you. And that awareness prepares the ground for what comes next, because there is a point where silence stops feeling like safety and starts feeling like loss. And when that shift happens, attention begins to turn elsewhere, away from managing others, away from managing perception, towards something quieter, deeper, and harder to ignore. That movement hasn't arrived yet, but it's close enough now that you can feel it approaching like a change in the air before the weather turns. Watching others decide without explaining. At some point, the silence becomes noticeable, not because of what you're not saying, but because of what you're seeing. You start paying attention to how other people move through choices, not in a comparative way at first, more like quiet observation. You notice the rhythm of their decisions, the way they state something and let it stand. It might happen in small moments. Someone declines an invitation without elaboration. Someone chooses a different path without apologizing. Someone says, "I can't," and doesn't rush to soften it. You register these moments almost accidentally, the way you notice a detail in a familiar room that was always there but never stood out. At first, there's a sense of surprise, not judgment, just recognition that another way exists, that decisions can be spoken plainly without the layers you've learned to add, that clarity doesn't always lead to conflict. Sometimes it leads to acceptance. Sometimes it leads to nothing at all. You watch how the conversation moves on, how no one demands an explanation, how the world doesn't pause to scrutinize the choice, and something inside you shifts not into action but into attention. You start seeing these moments everywhere. At work, when someone sets a limit and continues with their day. In friendships, when someone states what they can offer and doesn't negotiate beyond that. In family dynamics, when someone opts out without providing a backstory. What stands out isn't boldness, it's ease, the absence of visible strain, the lack of follow-up. These people don't seem to brace for impact after making a choice. They don't hover over it waiting to see how it lands. They simply move on. You wonder what it feels like to live that way, to make decisions that don't require maintenance, to trust that a statement can exist without explanation. The thought feels both distant and strangely familiar, as if it points to something you once knew but set aside. You don't immediately romanticize this behavior. You don't tell yourself you should be like them. You just notice the contrast, how different it feels from the way you've learned to operate, how much energy you expend managing reactions that they don't seem to anticipate. This observation doesn't produce envy so much as curiosity. You begin to ask quiet questions, not out loud, not even fully formed. What are they trusting that I'm not? What do they assume will hold if they don't step in to manage things? You notice how your body reacts in these moments, a slight tightening, a small pull. As if part of you leans forward, wanting to follow, while another part holds back, reminding you of the rules you've lived by. Those rules are familiar. They say things like, it's better to explain, it's safer to soften, it keeps things smooth, they've guided you well, they've helped you avoid misunderstandings, they've kept you in good standing. But watching others decide without explaining introduces doubt into those rules. Not enough to dismantle them, but enough to question their universality. Enough to wonder whether what you learned was a necessity or a strategy shaped by circumstance. You begin to see that decisiveness isn't always received as harshness, that silence after a clear statement isn't always hostility, that not explaining doesn't automatically lead to distance. Sometimes it leads to respect, sometimes it leads to neutrality, sometimes it leads to nothing at all. This realization is unsettling because it suggests that the labor you've been doing may not always be required, that the explanations you've been offering might not be as essential as you believed. You don't know what to do with this information yet. It doesn't translate into behavior. It simply lingers. It complicates your understanding of what's possible. You start noticing how quickly you step in when others hesitate, how you fill gaps, how you offer reasons before anyone asks. And now you see that this is a choice, not an inevitability. There's a moment when you catch yourself mid-explanation and stop, not because you've decided to change, but because the words suddenly feel unnecessary. You pause, the silence stretches for a beat, and then the conversation continues anyway. Nothing bad happens. No one reacts strongly, no one seems offended. The world holds. This moment stays with you longer than it should, not because it was dramatic, but because it contradicts a long-held belief. That belief said silence would be misread, that clarity without explanation would cause rupture. Instead, there was just continuation, neutrality, flow. You don't repeat this experiment often. You're not ready to. But knowing it's possible alters the landscape. It introduces a crack in the structure you've been living inside. You become more aware of how often you assume responsibility for other people's comfort, how quickly you step into the role of translator, mediator, softener. Watching others opt out of that role without consequence makes that responsibility feel less fixed. It also brings up a subtle grief for the effort you've expended, for the vigilance you've maintained, for the version of yourself that learned early how to make things easier for everyone else. You don't blame that version. You understand her. You see how much she carried, how much she managed, how necessary she once was. But you also see how tired she is now. Watching others decide without explaining doesn't make you want to become someone else. It makes you wonder what parts of yourself have been shaped by necessity and which have lingered beyond their usefulness. You begin to sense that your silence, your softening, your retreat were all attempts to navigate the same tension. The tension between choosing yourself and remaining acceptable, between clarity and connection. Seeing others choose without explaining doesn't resolve that tension. It simply reveals that it can be held differently. You don't rush toward that difference. You remain where you are observing, letting the contrast work on you quietly, letting it unsettle your assumptions without demanding immediate change. This chapter doesn't end with imitation. It ends with comparison, with the quiet realization that the way you've been moving through the world is one way, not the way. And that realization opens a space inside you. In that space, something begins to loosen. Not your behavior, your attention. You start turning it inward, not to fix yourself, but to understand what you've been protecting all along. Because if others can decide without explaining and remain connected, then the question shifts. It's no longer about whether it's allowed, it's about why you've believed it wasn't. And that question doesn't point outward anymore. It points back toward you, toward the long history of how you learned to stay good, stay kind, stay acceptable. The story moves now from observation to cost, from noticing what others do to noticing what your way of doing things has taken from you. And that movement, subtle but irreversible, carries you into the next chapter. The cost that never gets counted. There is a moment when observation turns into accounting, not in a deliberate way. You don't sit down and list what you've lost. It happens more quietly than that in the accumulation of small recognitions that begin to weigh on you. You notice how often your days feel full but not settled, how conversations leave you slightly drained even when nothing difficult was discussed, how you move from one interaction to the next with a sense of unfinished business, not because something went wrong, but because something never quite arrived. You start to see that the effort you've been making has never been free. It has taken time, attention, energy. It has required you to stay alert, to anticipate, to adjust. It has asked you to be present, not just to what's happening, but to what might happen if you're too clear, too firm, too final. This effort doesn't show up on any calendar. It doesn't get acknowledged. It doesn't look like labor, but you feel it. In your body when you sigh without knowing why. In your mind when you replay exchanges that seemed ordinary. In your choices when you default to what's easiest for everyone else. The cost has never been dramatic. That's why it's taken so long to notice. It hasn't arrived as a breaking point. It's arrived as a dulling, a flattening, a gradual distance between what you want and what you allow yourself to express. You realize now that the silence you've been practicing isn't neutral. It hasn't simply protected you from discomfort. It has also kept you from being met, because people can only respond to what you show them, and you've been showing them a version of yourself that's careful, adaptable, endlessly reasonable. That version is impressive. She's competent. She's steady. She's reliable. She keeps things running. But she is also tired. Not in a way that sleep fixes. In a way that comes from holding yourself at a remove. You start noticing how often you feel invisible in moments where you are technically included. How often you feel disconnected even while being polite, engaged, responsive. It's not that others are ignoring you. It's that they're responding to the version of you that manages, not the part that decides. This realization stings not because it's cruel, but because it's accurate. You see how the habit of explaining, softening, retreating, and silencing has shaped the kind of presence you offer. You've made yourself easy to accommodate, and in doing so harder to encounter. You don't feel angry about this. You feel something closer to grief, a recognition of what might have been possible if you had trusted your clarity sooner, if you had allowed your choices to stand without translation. But grief doesn't demand action. It asks for acknowledgement. And that's what you're doing now. Acknowledging that the cost has been real, even if it's never been named. You begin to see how often you've absorbed disappointment silently. How often you've told yourself it's not worth bringing up. How often you've chosen to let something go, not because it didn't matter, but because saying it would require too much explanation. Each of these moments seemed small, insignificant, not worth the trouble. But together, they formed a pattern of self-deference that has shaped your life in ways you're only now beginning to feel. You don't blame anyone else for this. No one forced you. No one demanded that you disappear. You stepped back because it worked, because it kept things calm, because it kept you included. But inclusion without presence is thin. It doesn't nourish. It doesn't anchor. And over time, you've felt that thinness more acutely. You notice how often you feel restless without knowing why. How often you crave solitude, not for rest, but for relief. Relief from managing, relief from explaining, relief from the constant low-level vigilance. In those quiet moments alone, you sometimes feel closer to yourself. Not because you're doing anything special, but because you're not performing. You're not anticipating. You're not adjusting. You're simply there. That contrast makes the cost clearer. You see how much effort it takes to maintain the version of you that the world knows, and you begin to wonder whether that effort is still serving you. This wondering doesn't turn into rebellion. You don't suddenly speak up everywhere. You don't reclaim lost ground. That would be another performance, another role. Instead, something else happens. You stop dismissing the weight you feel. You stop telling yourself it's nothing. You stop minimizing the exhaustion that comes from constant self-management. You let yourself register the truth of it, that always choosing the path of least resistance has quietly resisted you, that always being good has come with a price you've been paying alone. This chapter doesn't end with confrontation. It ends with clarity of cost, with the understanding that what you've been doing has shaped not just your relationships, but your sense of presence within them. You don't yet know what you'll do with this understanding. You don't need to. Knowing what something costs is not the same as deciding to stop paying. But it does change the transaction. You are no longer unaware. You are no longer assuming that this effort is free. You see the toll it takes. And that seeing alters your relationship to it. Because once you know the cost, you can't unknow it. And that knowledge, quiet and steady, begins to reorganize something inside you. Not your behavior, your center of gravity. And from that shift, something else becomes possible. Not action, not change, but presence. A different way of being with yourself, even as the old patterns continue. This is where the story turns toward its ending, not with resolution, but with a new orientation, away from constant outward adjustment, toward a steadier inner position. What comes next is not louder, it's quieter, and it doesn't announce itself, it simply remains. The space that remains. There is no moment where everything clicks into place. No scene where you finally say the perfect thing and feel completely at ease. That kind of ending belongs to stories that need closure. This one doesn't. What you have now is not an answer, but a presence. A steadiness that wasn't there before, not because you've changed what you do, but because you've changed how you see it. You still explain sometimes, you still soften, you still go quiet. None of that disappears overnight, but it no longer feels automatic. It no longer feels invisible. There is a space now between the impulse and the action. A pause where you notice yourself, where you sense the pull to manage to adjust to make things easier. And in that pause, you are still with yourself. That alone changes the quality of your presence. You're no longer disappearing without knowing it. You're no longer mistaking accommodation for connection. You're aware of the choice even when you make it the same way. This awareness doesn't make you harder. It doesn't make you colder. It makes you present. Present to the cost. Present to the habit. Present to the version of yourself that has carried so much without complaint. You don't rush to abandon her. You don't turn against her. You honor what she's done. You recognize her intelligence, her sensitivity, her capacity to navigate complexity. And at the same time, you stop letting her run everything unchecked. There are moments now, brief and unremarkable, where you let a choice stand without explanation, where you resist the urge to soften, where you allow a silence to remain without filling it. Nothing dramatic happens in these moments. No applause, no rupture. Just a quiet sense of being where you are. That sense doesn't need reinforcement. It doesn't need validation. It simply exists. You begin to trust it, not because it's proven itself, but because it feels anchored. Because it doesn't require you to perform or manage or anticipate. This is not about becoming someone else. It's about returning to a part of yourself that was never gone, only deferred. You don't announce this return. You don't explain it. You let it be internal, private, steady. And from that steadiness, your presence changes subtly. Not in ways others can easily name, but in ways you can feel. You're no longer leaning forward all the time. You're no longer bracing. You're not waiting for permission to exist inside your own decisions. You still care. You still notice. You still adjust when it matters. But you're no longer doing it at the cost of disappearing. The story doesn't end with certainty. It ends with authority of a quieter kind, the kind that doesn't need to be stated to be real. You don't know exactly how this will shape your life. You don't need to. What you know is this: you are no longer explaining yourself away, and that is enough to stay with.